Tranquility du Jour, July 11th, 2017. Hello there, this is Kimberly Wilson, and welcome to the 400th episode, celebrating nearly 12 years, September is 12 years, of Tranquility du Jour. I'm so happy you're here, and thank you for your patience as we were delayed one day in getting it out. And I'm so excited to be here for the 400th. It sounds like so long, so big, this week's episode. And throughout it, what I'm going to do is talk a bit about the 5 lessons that I've learned really since starting this podcast. And a lot of them are aligned with HTC 10, which some of you may recall. HTC 10 was the I guess you would call it an ebook. It was like a 100,000 word piece that I put out, which is, to give you an idea, it's a quarter the size of Hip Tranquil Chick. So that was my first book that came out in 2006. And so in December, I put out an HTC 10, which is basically 10 years later, Hip Tranquil Chick. And really, if we think about it, it is 10 plus 2-ish years later since this podcast launched. And I recall when it launched, I was at a friend's wedding in Mexico, and I made my boyfriend go into the other room so that I could record it, and I basically read verbatim. And I was there reading about writing a book, because I don't think I had this book deal yet for Hip Tranquil Chick, but I was in the process. I think I had an agent and I was working on writing it at that point. So really, the 5 lessons that I learned and since Hip Tranquil Chick really totally ties into this podcast and its evolution. And then I also want to share with you what's bringing me inspiration these days. Because as you've heard, through this podcast since 2005, there's been a lot of different people interviewed, ideas shared, various things supported, acknowledged, showcased, really from, I feel like it's a lot of authors, a lot of activists, and a lot of artists. So I just want to say a big thank you to those of you who've been tuning in. I know some of you since 2005. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And I hope that today's podcast will be somewhat enlightening of just like what it's been like to kind of pull this together. What are the lessons that I've learned and what's coming up? What's next? And really what's bringing me inspiration? Like, what am I dreaming about these days? And so I'll start with the lessons. And, there are 5 lessons, and I feel like they've been pretty well emphasized in this podcast over the years. But what I'm going to do is share them and then give a little bit of story behind them and how they have been a part of my life over, these past 400 episodes or 399 episodes. So the first one is simplify, which I'm sure many of you can relate to. One of the big things that I feel like has come out in maybe the past 5 years of the podcast is kind of moving towards more minimalism. And, that is as simple as like decluttering, capsule wardrobe, packing your lunch versus going out to lunch. This idea of just simplifying our life. And I talk a bit about this in HTC 10, and I'm going to read a piece about that because it's so important to me, and it's really a big part of my trajectory, even in 2017. Number 2 is bigger isn't always better. Talk about that. Number 3, everything in moderation. Number 4, create everyday experiences. And number 5, Paris is always a good idea. And then also, one of the pieces that I wrote in HTC 10 that's really a big part of who I am, and I think what's in my future, is this piece about don't forget the animals that I talk about in HTC 10, but I also recently posted on my blog, and I'll have a link to that. And I'm just going to pull that up real quick because I think like this is one of my favorite pieces that I've written. And I think it says so much in so little, meaning in such a kind of quick blog post. But this came out actually since my last podcast, and it's called What Makes You Come Alive? And again, I'll have a link to that. But the quote that I chose was by Howard Thurman. And it says, "Don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive and go do it. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive." I think that says so much in so little. And I wrote this piece right before we headed out to celebrate my 44th birthday, which was on June 30th. And I also was pulling it together for the July Muse for Tranquil Spaces newsletter. And then I was like, let me turn it into a blog post too. And it's the piece, "Don't Forget the Animals," that I wrote for HTC 10, just kind of expanded and grown. And so I will also again have a link to that and share a bit of that in today's podcast. So simplify. So with simplification, and you'll hear me turning pages because I'm turning my copy of HTC 10. And in this piece, what I really talk about, and many of you who have been longtime listeners will remember this and can probably relate to this if you've lost anyone in your life who is really special to you. And in 2012, I lost my grandmother. And this piece really, it talks about that experience. And then it also talks about kind of how that led me to make some pretty big changes in my life. So if you think about it, with loss or with something that is quite kind of jarring and shocking and upsetting, oftentimes what happens is there's change that comes along with it. And on the front of HTC 10, I have this quote: "New beginnings are often disguised as painful endings," which again, many of you may relate to that idea. So in this piece, I really talk about the loss of my grandmother. And then I talk about, this is my favorite pieces too, where I say back in DC. So whenever I got back after being with her when she passed, I was in a daze. I went about my daily practices of work, school, and home, but I moved in slow motion. The feeling was like being encased in concrete. It was hard to get going in the mornings. Getting out of bed was a small victory. A couple months of this led to numerous missed meetings and declined invitations. So I knew I needed to make a change. I explored my options, stop this, give up that. After much consideration, I settled on transitioning out of day-to-day studio operations such as bill paying, teacher management, and marketing. And then I go on to talk about how, since 1999, when I started Tranquil Space, so it's its 18th year anniversary this year, I had focused on building and maintaining this baby, Tranquil Space, that I was still nursing around the clock. And then I talk about sending a memo of sorts to my team, letting them know I was going to go on a semi-sabbatical. So I was still involved with the studio, still teaching, still kind of helping with the vision, marketing, but I had really pulled away from like the day to day. And then whenever I wrote HTC 10, I talk about I have no plans to return to that role. And what I mean is this role of like 24/7 care to the studio. And so I also go on to talk about how there's this wonderful book, and some of you have probably read this, called The Joy of Less by Francine J. And if you don't know this book, you might really, really like it. And I feel like she even did an updated version recently. And I'll put a link in the show notes also to this. And so one of the pieces that she wrote that really stuck with me is when we're always doing, it's easy to lose sight of our true selves. We come to think of ourselves as the overworked middle manager, the guy who owns an auto repair shop, or the girl who owns a yoga studio, or the stay-at-home parent who cooks, cleans, and drives the kids around, instead of the person who loves haiku, dreams of being a singer, or yearns to make a difference in the world. Remember the quote, "Music is in the space between the notes." When we take the time to just be, we're appreciating that space, those moments between meeting clients and paying bills and picking up the dry cleaning. And in the process, we stop defining ourselves by what we do and start to realize who we are. Isn't that beautiful? And so I go on to say, for years I challenged myself to accomplish more, learn more, add more to my plate. And there was a pride really in like doing all this stuff. And this is also something that I've found to be a big shift in my kind of responses. So when people would be like, how are you? How are you? How are you doing? And I would always respond, crazy busy. And now that sort of a response is like jarring to me. There was this wonderful article that came out I think it was the New York Times, called The Busy Trap. And once that came out, and I can't even remember the year, but it was around this, I stopped saying busy when people were like, how are you? And even I remember at times, friends would be like, oh, can we get together? And I'd be going through my calendar and I'd be like, okay, 6 months. I think Thanksgiving night, I'm free, and it's just like, that is no way to live a life. At least that's not how I want to live mine anymore. And my grandmother's death is really what brought that to the forefront. Ideally, it doesn't take such an intense loss to be reminded of what's important. But for me, it did. And it really opened my eyes to make changes. And so I write here, losing grandma and experiencing a long period of grief helped me reprioritize what mattered most. I seek spaciousness and try to carve it into even the busiest days. I go to Target once a year. I used to love going to Target, and stick to necessities or consumables with small luxuries like face oil, specialty magazines. I allow myself naps, days without yoga, and unscheduled time. And then I talk about even stopping teaching a weekly yoga class after the heart-wrenching loss of my pug, Louie, which happened 2 years ago to brain cancer. And so although I still struggle with wanting to do more and feeling behind on my dreams and to-dos, again, I'm sure many of you can relate, I've learned to subtract rather than add. I see continued simplification in my future. Less stuff, less commitments, less waste, less on the schedule. More space, more travel, more experiences, more time with friends, more work for the animals. And so really, the simplification or simplify has been a big, big lesson for me over the years. Lesson 2 is bigger isn't always better. So in this piece, and many of you have probably read this again with HTC 10, or it's a piece that I'm writing about a lot for my memoir that I'm working on and have been working on for the past few years. And I talk about that very first night in my living room in October 1999 when I invited strangers into my 4th floor walk-up. Right. And then I go into talking about the evolution as we grew from my living room to a church parlor to a sweet commercial space. So, kind of our first commercial lease on P Street, which is right off DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. And it was this sweet 2-level space that was painted pink and had all sorts of polka dot fabrics and toile. And then our transition to our current space in DC, which is a 4,000 square foot 3-level space, right? Beautiful with chandeliers, really, really sweet. But I talk about in this piece, and this is something that I'm learning too, is that bigger isn't always better, right? There's so much to manage as we grow, whether or not it's a family, it's the amount of animals we adopt, or it's a business that we grow and develop. And so I talk about how the big struggle was, it was the first time I took on debt, right? Whenever we moved into this space, which was May of 2008, we moved in. And of course, what happened in September of 2008? Well, there was this minor issue with the economy. And so that was a really scary time because I had this $350,000 SBA loan. And of course, the build out cost 50% more than it was supposed to. And and the economy was tanking. So I really talk a lot about this. And then I go on to say, over the past 10 years, I've come to recognize the many ways I struggle with bigger is better. I'm an introverted HSP. Some of you may relate to this. It's a highly sensitive person who needs lots of time to regenerate after energetic output. I created a business that has been filled with energetic output, teaching, managing, decision-making, full financial and emotional responsibility. So despite spending my adult life building a business that has brought jobs and tranquility to so many through yoga, classes, right, global retreats, specialty workshops, and trainings, I've struggled to find it myself. The lesson I finally learned is that growth isn't everything. Personal growth, yes, but not growth for growth's sake. While we had outgrown our previous studio locations, taken on such a large responsibility, and recognizing my energetic dilemma, all while dealing with an economic recession, was discombobulating. I'm now drawn to small, manageable, contained visions focused on 1 or 2 projects versus juggling many at a time. I care deeply about the community we've created and the family of teachers, some who have been with us for 15 years, and one actually who started in my living room, which is amazing, not as a teacher, but as a student. And so I care more deeply about that than the square feet of the studio or whether or not we're ranked the best in DC. So I remind myself that less is more. I'm slowly trying to reel back in a vision that I cast into the lake a decade ago. I hope to find the balance that feels right for me now at 44. I used to think bigger was better. Now I believe ease is best. And I think that comes along a lot too with the mindfulness trainings that I've been doing over the past few years. Lesson 3, everything in moderation. Right. So here I talk about the surgeries that I had in 2010 to repair a torn rotator cuff in my shoulder, clearly, and then an arthritic thumb. And I also talk about the challenges, right, that went along with this because I was told not to practice yoga for 3 months after each surgery. And not because yoga was bad for me, just like no exercise. And so I talk about this whole experience and the challenge too of acclimating to the fact that I was super weak, just because I didn't have the strength. I mean, A, after surgeries, but B, after not being able to exercise for so many months. So I kind of talk about all of that. And then I say many years later, I continue to struggle with both joints. And a few more. Those of you who are aging, you know what I'm talking about. My daily practice looks very different. For years, I loved arm balances and inversions. Now I stick to non-weight bearing modifications and a block under my lower back with legs extended up in the air instead of doing shoulder stand. I've learned that as my body changes, I change. My energy level changes, I change. My idea of a yoga practice changes, I change. And then also I talk about the struggle with like the fancy arm balances and things like that are done in class. And I used to do those. I used to love doing them, right? But now I always choose the modified version. But inside I want to say, or wear a t-shirt that was like, I used to be able to do that. I think I could do it if I tried really hard, but I really would rather not. So I don't. And it's just like, oh, Lord, have mercy. So it's interesting to just watch that dialogue going on in my head. And then I say yoga, work, play, green smoothies, meditation, books, chocolate wine. All these are wonderful things. Yet everything is best in moderation. For years, I've flagellated myself for not getting enough done, for not reading enough, for not being disciplined enough. While I still struggle with this, I also live with the physical impact of pushing past my edge. The Roman philosopher Seneca is thought to have said, at least, everything that exceeds the bounds of moderation has an unstable foundation. So I used to think yoga was about pushing myself into advanced poses. Now I see yoga and life as a practice of listening to and loving a broken but beautiful body. And then the next lesson is creating everyday experiences. And that's something I really try to do. And those of you who follow on Instagram or, again, have listened to the podcast for years or, have read any of my books, you know this to be the case. And what I mean by this is, adding sweet little touches into the everyday to create an experience. And so I talk about how I really tried to do this, say, with the Tranquility Tour. So that was in 2013. My partner Tim and I and our pug at the time, Mr. Louie, headed out on a cross-country adventure, North America adventure. We went up into Canada, all around the U.S., and it was so fun to meet some of you there. We hosted 23 Tranquility Tour pop-ups, and such a treat to be there with some of you in person, because of course I've known you through blog or podcast, but I have not actually been able to connect with you in person. So that was really sweet. And so I talk about, how we set that up, either the pop-ups, for it to be an experience, like complete with twinkle lights and Carla Bruni music and, whatnot. And then I also talk about how even Tranquil Space, my yoga studio, it's like set up so that there's attention to all the senses. So I say touch through poses and assists, smell through lavender spray and aromatherapy diffusers, taste through tea and cookies, sound through inspiring music, and sight through an inviting space painted in soothing colors with attention to details such as chandeliers, handmade pillows, and damask print touches. So I go on to say my days also begin and end with sensory experiences: walking the dogs, making tea, soaking in the tub or shower, doing yoga, lighting a candle, listening to the world wake up around me. So creating experiences within every day isn't about perfection or having a life that always goes smoothly, because we know it doesn't work that way. It's about making the most of what I have. And then I go on to talk about last August, which some of you may remember because I shared it on the blog. We had water damage on the condo. I was sitting here, I think I was working on a blog post, and I heard the sound of like running water. And I thought, oh, something's going on outside. And then it starts dripping from the ceiling. And the person who lives above me, their dishwasher was flooding. And it was all, it came through our place like severely, destroyed half of the floor, half of the ceiling. And it was really, really a big problem. But even in this piece, I talk about how I still tried to create experiences. So I had the loud sounds of fans drying. I was missing half a wall, half a ceiling, and half a floor. And yet, having music, picking up flowers to make the space still seem sweet, even though I was living in like 200 square feet of space. Having twinkle lights, all these sorts of things really help to create a little bit more calm within the chaos. And then I go on to say too, when I travel and I'm away from my creature comforts or routine, as I was even like last weekend, I was up in New York, but I always haul certain things. I found that creating an experience while on the plane or in a hotel room or staying with a friend at an Airbnb in the Lower East Side, as I was last weekend, always helps to make my journey pleasant. There are a few things that I don't leave home without, even if it's just a day trip. For those quick jaunts, I dress in comfy layers and tote earplugs. Always. I have earplugs in my purse at all times. Lip balm, Advil, a hair tie, a bag of tea, and packets of emergency. And if you guys don't know emergency, it's really yummy, but it's like all these electrolytes and it's kind of like a tangy flavor. For those of you who grew up on Tang, as I did. And then you just sprinkle it into your water and it's really yummy. A book, always a book. Or of course, if you have your phone or Kindle, you've got tons of books. A bag of nuts. And my new thing is it's raw almonds, but I like to put in dried apricots. Oh my gosh, like my mouth is watering just saying that to you. Because it's like this sweet flavor, right? That's added to the not so sexy raw almonds. But it's super filling. Lavender oil, a journal and pen, sunglasses, reusable water bottle, and a phone charger. And then for overnighters or longer stays, I add in extra tools such as candle and lighter, reusable bag for farmers markets or shopping, packets of crystallized lemon for my morning detox drink because I like doing fresh ginger if I have it, 2 of these crystallized lemons, and then hot water, an eye mask, slippers, and a travel yoga mat. So I say even in the professional settings of the therapy room, as I sit with clients, I have a lavender diffuser, offer tea or water, and keep a blanket and pillows to adjust for comfort. My commitment to creating beautiful experiences, even on the go, has permeated most aspects of my life. And while it may seem trivial to plug in twinkle lights, dab lavender oil, or insert earplugs, I found these practices help make the mundane magical. So that's lesson 4, this idea of creating everyday experiences. And so even just kind of looking around your home or your setup, what is it that would help to bring about a little more tranquility or joy. Another thing I travel with, like whenever I was up in New York City last weekend, I had some thank you notes to write. And so I had them all addressed and I had the stamps on them and the return address stamped. And then I just needed to pen the thank yous. And so while my friend was showering, I was getting these written out. So whenever I travel too, I like to have note cards. But it's like for you too, if you like to write letters, but you don't, could you set your stationery out on your desk or someplace where you're going to see it regularly? And to me, this helps create this sense of everyday experiences. The lesson 5, I'm sure you can probably imagine, is going to be Paris is always a good idea. And when I say that, many of you probably know about my love affair with Paris. I decided not to do a Pitting in Paris retreat this year, but I do hope to get out there at some point, probably fall, or I've never been there during winter, so that might be fun too. So in this piece, what I talk about is how in 1995, I first traveled to Paris. And what's funny is this girlfriend I met up with in New York City last weekend, we actually met under the Arc de Triomphe there back in 1995. She was studying abroad. She's a friend I grew up with in Oklahoma. I've known 30 years. And she was studying abroad, living in France. And so she and I, through letters, made a plan to meet under the Arc de Triomphe, I don't know, maybe noon or something on a Saturday. Well, she reminded me about that while I was visiting with her. And she reminded me that we were both like 3 hours late, and yet we were still there waiting for each other. And isn't it funny how nowadays, we have our phones and we're like, where are you? If they're not there like in 3 minutes. And so what we also remembered is I had run into a girl in Belgium because I was going to Belgium. I was in the UK, went to Belgium, and then to France. And so in Belgium, I'd run into some really sweet girl in a hostel who ended up traveling with me and my friend to Paris. Turns out this girl lived in Seattle, but she had grown up with my friend in Oklahoma, like grade school. So they were able to have this fun reunion, under the Arc de Triomphe. I'm like, look who I found in Belgium. And what are the chances this woman lived in Seattle, but yet had gone to grade school with my other friend? And so what's funny is while we were at dinner Friday night in New York City, I reached out to her on Facebook because I was like, what was her name again? I couldn't remember. But of course, my friend knew since they had spent some time together in grade school. So I friended her on Facebook and was like, I'm here with so-and-so. We were just talking about that crazy time we all met up in Paris. So it's funny, and my friend was like, that's my favorite small world story. But anyway, I don't talk about that in this piece about Paris, but that was my first experience with Paris. And I really, I loved it. I definitely loved it, but I didn't appreciate it the way I do now. I was a girl from Oklahoma, completely shocked with everything I was seeing. It was just so overwhelming, huge, ornate, gorgeous. And also back in those days, there wasn't the euro. So we were taking the money from every country and having to change it and using payphones and calling hostels where they don't speak English to see if they have a space for us. It's just like, it was really hard back in the days to do this. And so I think too, backpacking for a couple months, I was actually, the level of appreciation for things is a little harder because you're kind of in survival mode the whole time. But here I talk about in this piece that since I've gone back, like I started going back in 2009, I think, and then I've been going pretty much every year. I talk about how special that Paris is to me and why. So I say here, let's start with the simple. It's the beauty that infuses daily life in Paris, which, as you can imagine, that ties into lesson 4, right? About creating experiences in the everyday, because that's what I feel like the Parisians do so well. Author Vicky Archer says, Paris is a poem of adjectives and a list of superlatives. So I go on to describe things that I adore. Open-air markets filled with fresh produce displayed in colorful rows. Iconic arched bridges enhanced with gold leaf statues and iron lampposts, lingering at sidewalk cafes to sip pots of green mint tea. black clothing, and ballet flats. Flower markets filled with peonies, my favorite, roses and lilies always displayed by color. So sweet. Passion for physical books. There's physical books everywhere. Physical bookstores. It's like such a thing. An abundance of bubbly and rosé. Rows of Haussmann buildings. Details inside these buildings. Crown molding, fine linens, crystal chandeliers, antique furnishings, colorful front doors. You've probably seen all those photos of people posing in front of all the beautiful colored front doors. Wrought iron balconies filled with flowers. Afternoon tea at the Four Seasons. The enjoyment and encouragement to stroll aimlessly, flaneur, entirely on foot. Gertrude Stein and Hemingway's homes. Rose macarons. Okay, I'm so going to butcher this. My French is horrible. Please forgive me. Pain à chocolat, crepes, and frites. I do know my frites. That's French fries. Moroccan hammams, spas and lingerie enhanced with lace bows and ruffles. Gothic churches, the Arc de Triomphe, and the Eiffel Tower. Pharmacies filled with skincare potions. Well-manicured gardens with greenery, statues, and flowers. Perfume, croissants, scarves, men in red pants, green too. Off-leash dogs going everywhere, even to restaurants with their companions. Bikes, motor scooters, and kid scooters as common forms of transportation. Museums filled with masterpieces. Edith Piaf and Carla Bruni, The Sounds of an Accordion, Red Lips, the Shakespeare and Company bookstore, and cafe. They just added, those of you who don't know, they just added a cafe, I think just last year, 2016 maybe. And now I go on to say, now for the complicated, and without being too cliche, it's the je ne sais quoi. You know, the quality that cannot be named or easily described. I feel it as I walk through the halls of Charles de Gaulle, which I must tell you that one time we took Louis to Paris. When we were over there for 6 weeks, I was leading 2 10-day retreats, and then we were taking 2 weeks to travel down the south of France and Provence in an RV, which I got to drive the whole time because Tim can't drive a stick shift. And it was massive. And as you can imagine, the streets, it was massive, meaning larger than a compact car. And so as you can imagine, the streets in Provence are not necessarily made for that. So it was quite an experience. But anyway, Charles de Gaulle, I always think of this. As soon as we arrived, you know, we had to go through all this paperwork to get Louis approved to go. And as soon as we arrived, he pooped right in the airport. And I was like, are you kidding me? So now every time we arrive at Charles de Gaulle, I'm like, remember what Louis did here? And so also sinking into the cabs as they pull into Paris. And I love it when I spot the Eiffel Tower. There's an energy there that's different than the bright, light-filled, frenetic pace of another big city, like New York City, where I was just in. So it's more of a feminine energy, whispering, savor me, slow down, drink me in. And when I return from jaunts to Paris, I try to keep the feeling alive. So I walk or bike to and from my appointments, so I don't have a car. I spray my face with a vitamin C infusion, dab on eye cream, pick up flowers and produce from the market. I meet friends for tea. I wear noir, red lips, and a colorful scarf. I have wine with dinner and tea after. Before bed, I spritz perfume and crawl under soft linens with a book in hand. And then I say, well, I may not live in Paris for more than a few days per year. I strive to infuse my days in DC with these little gems that make life special. As Annie Dillard says, how we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. I choose to embrace those everyday efforts with Parisian flair, attention to details, appreciation of beauty, and passion for pleasures. So that is number 5. And you guys have probably seen this a lot in things that I have shared over the years, particularly with regard to my passion for kind of the style, really, and particularly the detail. I just love the detail. Like whenever, you get a cup or a pot of tea or a cup of tea at a cafe, they usually bring it out with like a little doily underneath and a little side tea biscuit. It's just the sweet things that I really, 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 really appreciate. And so the last thing that I would mention, and again, this is from the blog post I recently shared, but it's also what I wrote about here in HTC 10. And my final takeaway is don't forget the animals. So I'm just going to read the piece actually that's updated and shortened. That's on my blog. I'll read that. And again, this is the quote that I shared earlier. Don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive and go do it. Because what the world needs is people who come alive. So I write, Friday is my 44th birthday, and we're celebrating with a jaunt to the rural Virginia countryside, followed by our first visit to stroll Virginia Beach's boardwalks, which we actually changed and ended up not going there because it was going to rain, and we thought the dogs may not like the fireworks, so we ended up staying more time in rural Virginia. Birthdays offer a time for reflection, and mine falls mid-year when it's good to review those New Year's resolutions and explore what's to come. In preparing for my birthday reflection, I've been thinking about the role of animals in my life. My deep connection traces back to early childhood. There were abandoned cats and dogs that became our family's beloved pets. In high school, when I found out that people actually purchased animals, I was shocked. I didn't understand because, of course, we'd only had mutts, and I didn't understand that there was such a thing of buying animals. So anyway, it's a little aside. Followed by numerous fish, newts, and hamsters. Precious, and I had another one that started with a P, Peppy maybe. And then turtles became my first true obsession at the age of 7. And in Don't Forget the Animals, I talk about how I actually have my turtle scrapbook that I started when I was young. My mother gave it to me last year when I was home for summer. I was obsessed with turtles, right? And so I had a few turtles that we had rescued, found on highways or in ponds or what have you, little babies. And I had scrapbooks kind of all about them, and I would buy them little mini Christmas trees and little mini stockings and have a little Christmas celebration for them. Yes, I was an odd child, and I'm still a little odd. And when they passed, we would bury them out in the backyard. And one, actually, my very first one, Myrtle, who I found while with my grandmother on the lake Fort Cobb Lake in Oklahoma. And I picked it up because I thought it was just the shell. And then halfway home, I see poop on my hand, and I'm like, oh my God, this is alive. It's a red ear, which are the favorites. And I saw tons of red ears in Central Park in the ponds there. I was so excited last week. But anyway, I was obsessed with turtles. And my first activism is I started sending money to the Turtle Lady of South Padre Island, which if you're a turtle freak, you probably know about her. So my next obsession then were apes, because they all went to turtle heaven, which was very sad because I had friends who had turtles, red ears, that lived for years. And then it was apes. And I talk about here also in the piece that I'd written for HTC 10 about going to the Oklahoma City Zoo, being obsessed with watching Gorillas in the Mist, being in love with baby orangutan Mango, who I've searched high and low for. He's not at the Oklahoma City Zoo anymore. And then I got an email from somebody who recently told me he's in the Miami Zoo. So I have to go visit him. I was obsessed with this little orangutan. I actually had a dream that I stole him from the zoo. And this is in college. Again, little odd. So then I go on to talk about meeting pigs. All right. And that's my next obsession. So in April, as many of you know, in April 2007, I funneled through the receiving line for my coveted 300-hour Jiva Mukti yoga teacher training certificate. And at the end, teacher Sharon Gannon reminded us, don't forget the animals. I haven't. During the training, I learned about Farm Sanctuary and adopted a piglet named JD. He had been washed down a river in a flood and was the first of many adoptions. This small offering made me feel like I could have an impact on what was happening in factory farms. Now I know that there are 117.6 million pigs killed for food in the United States alone, and JD is only one survival story. In 2010 and 2012, I traveled to India to co-host yoga retreats. In between visiting temples and shopping for pink saris, I spent my time doling out tea biscuits in Rishikesh to street dogs and cows. I fell in love with a tan mutt who wandered the Lakshmanjula Bridge, dodging mopeds and pedestrians. He, as many, had a skin condition, a skeletal frame, and eyes that appeared enhanced with eyeliner. I visited him daily during our week-long stay, and we named him Lumpy G. Lumpy because of his skin condition, and G is a suffix added to names in Hindi to convey respect. Then I talk about last Saturday, I met up with 30 other animal lovers at Burley Manor Animal Sanctuary for our second annual Yoga and the Animals event. The day began with ice mint tea and a private tour of the sanctuary to meet goats, sheep, a cow, horses, mules, pigs, my favorite, of course, turkeys, chickens, geese, and donkeys. Next, we rolled out our mats on the green grass under a huge oak for an all-level practice. We were enveloped with a gentle breeze, sounds of the sanctuary, especially the chatty goose, and hands-on assist by a fellow teacher who joined me. And then I go on to say that, we raised $1,500 for the work of Burley Manor and $500 for my nonprofit's new Pigs and Pugs project. And we immediately used those funds, my nonprofit, to support Woodstock Animal Sanctuary's rescue of 4 sick piglets and their mother. My favorite Hindi mantra is Loka Samasta Sukhi No Bhavantu. And some of you may know I have that tattooed on my arm. And Sharon Gannon translated as, may all beings everywhere be happy and free. May the thoughts, words, and actions of my own life contribute in some way to that happiness and to that freedom for all. So I'm enrolled in University of Tennessee's veterinary social work program and have transitioned the work of Tranquil Space Foundation to focus on animal welfare. So no, Sharon, I haven't forgotten the animals. I believe all beings should be happy and free. And this is what makes me come alive. Namaste. So that's how I end that piece. And that is something, right? As I was talking earlier about what's bringing me inspiration these days. And it's funny, if I think back to 2005, inspiration was lots of yoga, of course, journal writing, reading. And it was reading a lot, though, about writing a book, particularly a nonfiction book, because I was working in theory on Hip Tranquil Chick at that time. And I think it was on promoting a book. And, this is before, granted, I did have a podcast, but it was before podcasts were popular and really before blogs were popular, because I'd started the blog in 2004 and really before social media. There wasn't, I don't even think, at least I wasn't on Facebook yet, or Twitter or Instagram and Pinterest, things like that weren't around yet. And so, my inspiration really then, it came from doing a lot, just going, as I said, making plans 6 months out to see someone for tea. And now I really, as I stated from one of the pieces that I read, I really instead am looking for more space. You may have noticed I've done a lot less projects. I had one virtual retreat. That's all I'm doing this year. I'm still debating whether or not I'm going to put the daybook out. I'm leaning towards no for the full planner, instead of maybe doing just a small piece that would be all the tools and all the things that are unique to the daybook that someone could instead have and use with their planner. So that's where I'm leaning there, just because with the amount of time it takes to pull the planner together. It's months, and then the printing of it and the shipping of it. As much as I love it, and I have loved it for the past 5 years, I'm debating not doing it this year. Again, simplification. I have not done as many retreats. I am really looking to add only more learning opportunities. So I may have overdone it right now. So I am signed up for the University of Tennessee's veterinary social work program, which they're creating this new online system for all their modules, and it getting pushed off, but it looks like I'll be able to start that, launch into it next month. And then I've signed up for a positive psychology certificate program. That's a 6-month program that starts in October. And then this week, I'm starting an online kind of write your memoir in 6 months program. And again, that starts tomorrow. And so I may have overdone it, but that's really where I am, is this learning, really wanting to learn, wanting to understand. As you know, I haven't been sending love notes the past couple of months. And again, it's not because I don't want to stay connected to the community. I just feel like I really need to pull in and retreat a little bit and refresh. And I feel that, since doing the podcast since '05, the blog since '04, I've never really taken time off. And so this is just a conscious effort to just pull back a little bit. And I do, of course, plan to be back. I just felt like I needed a little bit of space to kind of refill the creative well. And what's funny, this is really interesting to me, is I've noticed a lot of fellow bloggers or online people, people who do a lot of kind of, as I mentioned, blogs or programs or things like that online, also saying they're on like a social media sabbatical, kind of like July and August or all of July or things like that, which I love. And I had no idea this was like a thing. But it seems that the reason I bring this up is it seems that a lot of people are feeling this need. Now, I'm still posting on Facebook. I still am doing like a blog post pretty much every week. I'm still doing the podcast. I'm still Instagramming. I love Instagram. I think I took like 10 photos in New York City. It's so photogenic. But with that, I've pulled back from the every other week love notes, the more regular blogging, and the more regular posting. Again, just to kind of rejuvenate. So, the other thing too with inspiration, what's bringing me this inspiration these days is reading. Over my birthday weekend, I think I finished 4 books. Now, granted, they all but one had already been started because I tend to read multiple books at a time. And if you're curious what I'm reading or what I have read, because sometimes it's just fun to see like, what do people think? What are they reading? What do they like? I'm on Goodreads, and I'll put a link to that also in the show notes, because that might be something that is a helpful resource if you're looking for new fun books. But I did want to mention 2 that I was kind of excited about. One is called Apprentice to Venice. And this is a book by Tristine Rainier. And I'm obsessed with Anais Nin. And what's funny is I'm reading one of Tristine's books that's probably 20 years old. So anyway, maybe like 3 months ago, so I Google her just to see like what's she up to now. And I see that she's releasing a book about her relationship with Anais Nin. So when I got it, I immediately pre-ordered it. When I got it, I devoured it in like 2 or 3 weeks. And those of you who follow me on Instagram, you've probably saw me posting photos of it. I loved that book. It's a memoir about her experience again with Anais Nin. So it gives some insight into Anais, who was a really interesting woman, incredibly before her times. It was just absolutely a beautiful read, and she's a fascinating woman. And so is Tristine. And I loved that book. So I do recommend that if you have any interest in Anais Nin. The second book that I adored and highly recommend is by William Bridges, and it's called Transitions, Making Sense of Life's Changes. And who isn't in transition, frankly, on a somewhat regular basis, or at least going through change? And so the change piece, he says, change is situational, transition is psychological. So think about where you are, and are you in a space of change? Again, constant, as the Buddhists tell us, change is constant. Or is it a transition where it's like a psychological shift that you're going through? And, when I think back, hip trinkle chick, 2005, I definitely feel like I have been in a big transition. I feel like particularly so now. And when I say that, it's like a psychological shift, right? There's been a lot of shifts from what is important to me and what was important to me before, say in 2005, even 2010, to where I am now. It's very, very different. And one other thing I wanted to mention, while I was in New York City, I saw A Doll's House Part 2. A Dollhouse, excuse me. It's not plural. So, or possessive. A Dollhouse. And some of you probably read that play in high school. And it's really an interesting kind of, sociological look at women and their place in society. And A Dollhouse Part 2 is someone's take on what they think would happen if the woman who left her husband and family came back 15 years later. And I just stumbled upon it. So I took my friend to go see it on Broadway, and it was so, so good. So if you have a chance to see it, it's very reasonable. It's like $39. Or if you have a chance to read the original, I do recommend it, or to find the story for the part 2. And then the last thing, kind of in closing, I just wanted to share was the conclusion that I wrote for HTC 10, which I think really does sum up what's bringing me inspiration these days, and honestly, too, where I'm headed. Because I want to say a big thank you to those of you who submitted ideas for the 400th. And I was really struggling. There were so many good ideas and so many ways to take this. And many people were curious about, like, what have you learned? What's been the evolution since '05? And so I hope this has been helpful to kind of give some insight into really where I am, where I've been, what I've struggled with, what I'm learning along the way. And then this conclusion piece might give some insight into also kind of where I'm going or hope to be going. So when I faced challenging moments working on this HTC 10 piece, I remembered what Hemingway said about the creative process. There's nothing to writing. All you do is sit down at a typewriter and bleed. Bleed. Isn't that like so graphic? So at times it's felt that way. The past decade has not been the easiest, and yet I don't think I'd change many things. Each loss, challenge, and success has shaped who I've become in ways I could not have predicted in 2006. So that's for HTC 10. So for us, we're talking 2005. For someone with an entrepreneurial spirit who tends to operate with a 5-year plan in hand, the future feels cloudy at the moment, out of focus. I'm studying a new writing genre and feel frozen in my own process. That's memoir. I recently honored the 17-year birthday of the studio, and I'm sure what it needs to continue thriving. I'm passionate about my work to help animals, enrolled in that vet social work program, and dream of having a few rescue pigs. But I am unclear exactly where my activism will take me. Apparently, stuckness is ongoing and helps lead to transformation. Charlotte Castle, psychotherapist and author of If the Buddha Got Stuck, says, getting unstuck is not a one-time endeavor because, as the moon waxes and wanes, life's natural experiences, such as loss and change, repeatedly challenge us to let go, shift our perspectives, and bring new ideas and plans into our lives. Since junior high, I've had visions of collaborating with clients as a therapist in a cozy, light-filled room. This dream has been part of my week since I took a job as a pre-licensed therapist in July 2014. Looking ahead, I see myself continuing this work and launching a small private practice, which I've done in DC, and you can find information on that at KimberlyWilsonTherapy.com. Love my clients. It says, looking ahead, I see myself continuing this work, launching a small private practice, which I just mentioned. The one-on-one work reminds me of the sweet early days of Tranquil Space when I had an intimate relationship with the students. Over the next decade, I picture myself reading more books, writing more books, sipping more tea, taking more baths, and hitting the pause button on a regular basis. I plan to work with the board of directors to shift our nonprofit's mission to serving animals, which has been done, yay, and complete University of Tennessee's veterinary social work certificate program. I hope to return to Paris multiple times and host inspiring retreats around the globe. I intend to simplify my businesses, clothing line, yoga studio, and Tranquility du Jour offerings. And how all this will unfold, now that I don't know yet. Although no 5-year plan is in place, I do have an inkling of how I want to feel, and I am certain it's different than how I felt the past 10 years. These 5 lessons and overarching philosophy of don't forget the animals and what makes you come alive will continue to seep into my everyday and ideally help shape the next decade to allow space for what matters most: deep connection, rich conversation, simple joys, giving back, and I would add, making a difference for the animals. So this is the conclusion that I wrote in December of last year. And definitely everything there still holds true, except for I am now licensed and we have switched the focus of the nonprofit. So I also, with everything that I have shared today, and I know this is a long podcast, so feel free to listen to it in 2 pieces. Or to come back to this if there is anything that was helpful for you. I did want to offer just a special kind of thank you code. And this is a code for shopping at KimberlyWilson.com for a book, if you wanted a book, an ebook, perfume, tea, or CDs. So today through Friday, July 15th, if you use code podcast400, if you use that at checkout, you'll save 20% off of these items. And I also wanted to mention 2 films that I have recently watched that are amazing. Okja. So if you're not familiar with Okja, it's this wonderful film about a pig. And I'll kind of stop there, but it's really interesting, and also too about big corporation. So I think you would enjoy it. I mean, even someone who isn't like a crazy animal person like I am, I think will enjoy it. It's kind of like if you liked Old Yeller, or you like seeing people's, particularly kids' connection to animals. And then The Last Pig. Some of you may recall I interviewed the former pig farmer and the filmmaker for The Last Pig. And I got my copy recently, and it is phenomenal. So they're doing showings around the US, and actually, I think they even did one in Italy. So I should say around the globe. And I hope to host a screening of The Last Pig short soon. So stay tuned for that. I'll definitely share that information on the blog. And in addition, I will put links to the various things that I have mentioned in the show notes. And the show notes can be found at KimberlyWilson.com. So I want to say a big, big thank you for joining me, for being part of Tranquility du Jour, whether or not you are a new listener, an old listener, blog reader, book reader. We've met at some point, maybe at a pop-up or at the studio. I just want to say a big thank you for the support over the years. It means a lot. And I appreciate you evolving with me into kind of new things. And in the show notes, you'll also see the typical things that I have on the podcast, which is like, link to Tranquility and my social media and all that. And then finally, if you have a moment to pen a review on iTunes, I'd be so grateful. As I was preparing to record this today, I went back and I read some of the reviews and I was blown away. I don't think I've seen them in a while. And I really, really appreciate those of you who have taken the time to do that. And so if you have a moment, there's a link in the show notes on how to do that. I'd really appreciate it. And also, if you have read any of the books, I'd love to hear your thoughts about them on Amazon or Goodreads. So thanks again for tuning in. I hope that this has been a helpful and inspiring 400th episode, and stay tuned. In 2 weeks, we have a really fun one that's all about a woman who is transitioning into a lot of creative and artistic work. And we talk about the challenges associated and how to get on that path. And then another one that's coming up is with Janice McLeod. You guys may remember her from the bestseller Paris Letters. Well, she's back talking about her new book that just released called A Paris Year. So we've got some fun ones lined up for you. And of course, if you ever have suggestions or ideas, you're always welcome to pass them along. I'm Kimberly at KimberlyWilson.com. And thank you again for tuning in. Wishing you a phenomenal rest of your week. Namaste.